Welcome to Economics Matters. My name is Alex Kotlikoff, and I'm the co-producer of the show, along with Larry Kotlikoff, who is my father. Today, we're joined by Sebastian Mallaby, a financial journalist, amongst other things, a serious writer who has a incredible collection of columns and books, and so much work that I have yet to really dig into, but I know after this interview, I'm going to actually go out and start reading your massive compendium of work. I'd like to say that we're going to go for about an hour here, and we're going to have a free-ranging discussion about geopolitics, domestic and international economics, definitely touching on inflation, the causes of it, who's right, who's wrong. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about the Fed and what they've been doing and what they're considering doing, and more things, including Sebastian's latest book. So with that, I'm going to give it over to my father here, and he's going to give a more proper introduction.
Cool. Thanks, Alex. Let me, right at the get-go, do some advertising for Sebastian, which is, this is a brand new book called The Power Law. It's about the whole venture capital and the making of the new future. It's thick, but it's full of fascinating. It's a page turner from everything I could tell. I haven't had a chance to read it, but we're going to hear about it. And it just came out, and I think it's really kind of must reading for anybody who wants to really understand what's been going on in Silicon Valley, in the U.S. economy, and what might be happening in China that's parallel, and just kind of the future of, or the reality of what capitalism is actually about these days, and also all the personalities and the inside scoop. So Sebastian did an enormous amount of research to get. The detail here in this book is just incredible. But let me say more generally a few things about Sebastian. He's the Paul A. Volcker Senior Fellow for International Economics at the Council of Foreign Relations. That's a major title right there. Paul Volcker is a giant. He was not just a physical giant, but a policy giant. He was the chair of the Fed, and he stopped the hyperinflation. Well, no, we weren't having hyperinflation, but the high inflation we were having in the 70s. And I had the great opportunity to spend a couple sessions with him, including debating him on financial reform. And at one point, he was a lovely guy, and it's a great honor, clearly, to be called the Paul Volcker anything. But he's senior fellow for international economics at the Council on Foreign Relations, and just being a member of that is a big deal. He's an experienced journalist and public speaker. He contributes to a variety of publications, including Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic, The Washington Post. I think you were a regular columnist for the Post in the past. You seem to be a regular columnist again, because I was looking at your columns in the Washington Post. There's a zillion of them of late. And you write for the Financial Times. You worked for the Economist as a writer. Sebastian's the author of 5 books. The Power Law is the most recent, but there are 4 other terrific ones that are worth talking about. And then we're looking at, and then I guess well, let me just mention the names of the other books. We have the Man Who Knew, More Money Than God, and The World's Banker. So I guess this is your 4th book to date. And Sebastian is a graduate of Eton College, but after that he went on to get a scholarship to Oxford University, and he graduated in 1986 with first class degree in modern history. So Sebastian, I think maybe the thing to do to start us off here is to give us a little bit of a roadmap of kind of where you were born. I know your dad was an ambassador to both Germany and to France. So maybe a little bit about your childhood and the influence of your parents, but also how you ended up with this tremendous career in kind of looking at the big and the small, the micro and the macro, and the future. So take it away.
Sure. Well, thanks, Alex, and thanks, Larry, for having me. Um, yeah, my dad was a British career Foreign Service official, a diplomat. And as I look back on his career, which was spent, he spoke Russian, German, and French, and he was in all of those countries. Moscow, he was sent there twice, Germany 3 times, and France once. And the service of that career, does remind me often of the value of working for the government, public service, taking that seriously, being a professional committed to that. In the British system, more than in the US system, career officials get to rise to the top because there are much fewer political appointees. And that meant that he could become an ambassador in 2 important countries, Germany and France. But I mean, what strikes me more than the rank is simply, that he spent 30 something years doing this, and the dedication to trying to just do good diplomacy because he believed that jaw is better than war. Remains sort of inspiring to me. Because of his career and because my mum was French, I had a pretty international upbringing. I spent some time in Russia and Germany, as I was saying. I spent some time in New York City, where my father had a period as a promoter of British exports to the US. It was the 70s, and his big triumph was to notice that with flares, New Yorkers were having trouble not getting their pants hooked up in the bicycle chain if they were on bikes. And therefore, there was a market opening for clips that would go over your pants and prevent those flares from getting chewed up.
The bell bottoms.
And for some reason, the American market was not properly supplied, and the British market had plenty of good clips. And so, that was his big triumph. He also told me that he would go on all kinds of, local TV stations to try to talk up British business and promote the idea of trade with Britain. And on one, this was during the energy crisis of the 70s. We were talking about Paul Volcker. And on one of these occasions, he was asked, why is that British fuel consumption per head is lower than in the US? And he said, well, partly it's the size of the cars in the US. It's also that we just have a different attitude towards heating in our homes. We don't necessarily feel like you have to have the heating on all the time. For example, at night, you might not need it. There are other ways of keeping warm. At which point the presenter of the TV show threw up his hands in disgust and said, the British envoy has made a lewd comment on air. I mean, he just meant you have blankets on your bed, but it was interpreted in a different way. So these are some of the stories from my growing up. I think it left me with a sense that I wanted to do something international. I wanted to be maybe a foreign correspondent, not necessarily a diplomat. I did actually apply and I was admitted into the Foreign Service, but plan A for me was always to write. I love writing from when I was in my teens. And so I joined The Economist with the idea of being a foreign correspondent. And that part of it was inspired by my upbringing. And I went and spent some time in Africa, based in Zimbabwe, when Southern Africa was under a lot of change. Nelson Mandela came out of jail. I was outside his jail when he walked free. And I thought, at the age of 25, my career had peaked. Nothing could be as exciting again. And then I went from Africa back to London for a bit, wrote about finance. Larry, it might have been in that period when I was new to writing about finance that I called you up in desperation and you explained how pensions and savings work to me. So thank you. I remain grateful to this day. Um, and then I went to Japan with the Economist magazine, and from Japan I went to Washington D.C. And that's when I ended up switching, joining the Washington Post, writing columns there, writing editorials, and then segueing from that into books.
Well, that's fascinating story. So and background. So let's start things off by talking about where things are. And I was just checking CNN before we started here, and the latest things that are where things are, and with respect to Ukraine and Russia, is that the head of Luke Oil was just tossed out of the window from a hospital and died. And apparently, for making the mildest of criticisms about Putin's war in the Ukraine. So let's start off by getting your take on where that conflict sits and where it's going, and where it might end up.
Well, I think as that story tells us, it's just a horrible situation in which, Russia, having started the war, having invaded Ukraine, doesn't really want an off-ramp, right? It just wants to carry on war of attrition, no matter how isolated it gets internationally. There's, I mean, if we think about the invasion of Afghanistan, the Russians invaded Afghanistan in 1979? They withdrew how many years later? At least 10. This could go on for a very long time.
And
Yeah, right.
when you say war of attrition, my concern when all these references of Putin to nuclear war is that he's going to produce some accidents in the nuclear installations. The biggest one where there's the shelling, it's hard to pronounce, Zaporizhzhia or something, that the UN inspectors or the not sure it was you. Anyway, the inspectors came today to visit. That it's the biggest nuclear plant in Europe. So if you produce enough nuclear accidents, you can make Ukraine a ghost land and uninhabitable. And it's now it becomes a buffer zone between NATO and Russia. And I just wonder if that's really Putin's objective. 8 million out of 40 million Ukrainians have fled so far. And do you think that could be really what he has in mind, ultimately, especially if the Ukrainians, if their counteroffensive is successful and he starts to lose land?
I mean, I think that Putin is not mentally deranged, as people sometimes suggest, but I do think he probably, follows his instinct as he goes along. I'm not sure he would have a plan ahead of time that he is definitely going to use this nuclear option by, arranging an accident in a civilian nuclear plant. Mm-hmm. But he wants that option to be open. He wants the threat to be hanging over the West. He wants people to be scared. I think if you look at the way he's played the game with gas supplies to Western Europe, it's been to kind of turn it on, turn it off, cut it down, hint that you might cut it down some more. But it doesn't go from zero, he doesn't turn the dial the whole way in one go. He's playing with the dial because it's precisely that threat that you want to keep the adversary off kilter. I think if he were to, really trigger a serious nuclear event, in a way that's out of character, because that would be turning the dial definitively. I'm not saying it would necessarily elicit a nuclear response from the West. I don't think it would. But it would be such a sort of atrocity that maybe lower level destruction, grinding it out with the kind of missile warfare that we've seen is, more his style.
What's the yeah? What's in the case of of a strike on the nuclear plant? I mean, what can what could we expect? I mean, what is the actual fallout in terms of? I know it's very grim, but uh, what would that actually entail and look like? Um, in the region, and then for the rest of Europe.
I just don't know enough. I mean, I
Okay.
imagine that there are different types of accident that one could imagine. I remember seeing the documentary about the Chernobyl disaster, and the takeaway from that was that stuff could have been done earlier to make that a far less bad event if the authorities had acknowledged from immediately the evidence that this was a disaster that was unfolding. And it was because they refused to say that, refused to pass that message to Moscow, that they lost time in their reaction. So I feel like human agency is important here. What I don't know enough to know, how wide that goes.
I've been asking that question of some people, not real physicists, but I get the impression that depends on which way the wind is blowing, and that the fallout can go on for a long time. So that, and this major plant where they're having the attacks take place, that's pretty close to Crimea and to eastern or western Ukraine, and to the part of to the part of Ukraine that is occupied by Russian troops. So this could backfire. So maybe that's not the nuclear attack plant that he would attack. Maybe he'd attack one closer to the west, to Poland, to other parts of NATO. The let me ask you this, Sebastian. Suppose we contemplate the Ukrainians really pushing the Russians out of Ukraine, even out of Crimea. So now we've got Putin facing complete and total defeat. So we've got NATO expanding with Finland and Sweden. Presumably, Ukraine would be brought in as well, or effectively, it has been brought in. We have everything except U.S. troops. Well, we actually have, volunteer Americans and volunteer Westerners fighting there. So, how do you think he would react given everything you sense about this guy? You're saying he wouldn't turn up the dial the whole way, but if the dial's been turned up the whole way on him, how might he react? And how might the people around him react?
I mean, it is a scary prospect because implicit in your question is, would he push the nuclear button? And and then connected to that question is, if he were to try and do that, is there a prospect that the military command would ignore the order? And connected to that is the question of, would the military command, anticipating the order, actually get rid of him? Could a military defeat on the ground and the humiliation of Russia essentially turn some part of the elite? It would have to be the military elite. I don't think the business elite has any power whatsoever. Right. But the guys with guns could be the one. It would need to be the ones who turned on him. Do we have a read on what the odds are there? Not to my knowledge. So I do think it's a total black box. I think, Larry, you're right to raise this question because the West is supporting the Ukrainians in their ground attempt to reclaim territory. Have we thought about the end game? I'm not sure that's been in the public debate. Maybe I've missed it, but
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that was going to be my question. Is that first, do you have a sense of what Western powers, particularly the country that my father and I are in, feel in terms of an end goal? Uh, Presumably, they're not thinking of total victory over Russia and Putin. Presumably, there's some sort of settlement or um, negotiation that could be worked out to, gradually or hopefully get to a point of peace. Um, so that's, I guess, yeah, that's one question. Um, and then the other question is, what do you think maybe is the right path towards a negotiated settlement if you think that that's the right way to go?
I could also maybe throw out something specific, and you can also comment on that. So I've been writing that Biden needs to set red lines for Putin, saying that if there's a nuclear explosion in Ukraine, we're going to view that as an attack on the U.S., a nuclear attack. Make it perfectly clear that there's going to be a response, and that will start a war with the U.S. When Kennedy faced the Cuban Missile Crisis, he announced very clearly that an attack by Cuba on the U.S. would be viewed as an attack by Russia on the U.S. And I think that set the groundwork for agreement. So my preferred settlement would be that Ukraine is brought into NATO today, and this afternoon we also announce a ceasefire. NATO would announce a ceasefire with Russia and tell Putin, you can keep everything you've got, but if you continue to attack, you're going to be at war with NATO. And this would allow Putin to declare victory. We'd also eliminate the sanctions. And Zelensky, for his part, could say, well, we lost, but we won because we're now part of NATO and we know our future is secure. That, to me, is an out-of-the-box, but we're out of the box. But anyway, you go for it.
That's not my plan, by the way.
I mean, the thing about diplomacy is that, we can have plans, but what matters is the protagonists.
Mhm.
And would they accept those plans? And I feel like it's unlikely that, would Zelensky agree to say that territory taken in the last 7 months can be kept. Maybe if enough pressure was put on him, he could be made to agree to that. But and that's the question: is whether you can sell any of this stuff. I mean, what you can't do is kind of a Yalta type thing where you impose, the great powers meet, they have a discussion, and they say this is how we should settle it, and that'll be the deal. You kind of need, Zelensky needs to be in agreement with the plan. On the red lines thing, I think the trouble is, Cuba is super close to the US, and when there were missiles stationed there pointed at the US, that was an existential threat to the US. It's not actually true that a nuclear disaster in Eastern Europe is a threat to the US, not a direct threat. And so I think politically, the idea that an American president would launch a nuclear strike against Russia because of a power plant, exploding in the far reaches of Eastern Europe, I'm not sure the American electorate is ready for that.
I agree. Yeah.
Would they be ready for a nuclear reaction Biden is on record of saying we will respond in kind if Russians use nuclear weapons. So if Russia were to, let's say, blow up Kiev, what do you think the reaction of Biden might be? And what should it be?
I think in that case...
I'm pushing you.
Yeah, I know. I think in that case, a nuclear response by the US is both more plausible and more defensible. I mean, if the Russians use weapons from their nuclear arsenal, and we know that such weapons are also pointed against the US, it's less of a stretch to say this is a precedent which shows they're willing to do this, and we can't tolerate that. That is over the line. if it's a civilian reactor that blows up, I think it is in a different category.
Yeah, I think so too.
We've had
Yeah.
Chernobyl before. We've had Bhopal, which was not nuclear, but it was chemical. We've had, Fukushima. I mean, it would be different if, Putin might do it with plausible deniability, right? There could be a disaster in a nuclear plant, but he would say it wasn't me. I just think it would be very hard to respond on that basis with a nuclear strike. I think if Russian nuclear weapons clearly attacked Ukraine, that would be different. And I think there would be a response.
So
I was thinking maybe we should transition to talking about the effect of this war on the economy. I think we were going to ask, can Europe make it through the winter if Russia shuts down its entire gas supply of the West? Given that Europe was getting about 40% of its gas from Russia. Seems like there's some moves to transition in terms of where they're getting their gas. Maybe also some transition towards or doubling down investment into renewable energy. And what do you think about what the long-term economic impacts of all of this is? When we were talking to Martin Wolf, he was saying this is like the way I think of this is like a giant gas tax, particularly on Europe, which is kind of forcing the matter of inflation to become an issue where the central banks really have to do something, and in that case, that might also produce a recession. So, yeah, I guess it's the question is. Is that also your analysis as well? And if so, like what to do about that?
Well, there's the inflation and monetary channel that you just mentioned. And it's clear that European inflation is very high. It's high in a way that's different to the US. Right. European inflation is much more linked to the energy and food price shock caused by the Ukraine war, and specifically the gas supply shock. Gas bills in the UK, for example, are going to go up, I don't know, a factor of 4 or something for households. It's a huge cost of living crisis, which is a subject of big political debate. And the burden will be distributed differently in other European countries, depending on their regime, whether they allow pass-through of wholesale prices to the retail sector. But we know a couple of things. One is that the Germans in particular have cut dependence on Russian gas by a lot since February. I forget the precise numbers, but my memory is that they've cut the share of gas that comes from Russia by something like half, partly by importing some Dutch gas, partly by doing LNG deliveries, and partly by other tricks. I suspect that if the residual were to be suddenly cut off by Putin, remember that gas stocks have been built over the last few weeks. And so it's not like a cutoff from Russia would immediately take you to zero, but it would force either rationing or blackouts. Those are the two ways of cutting demand. And nobody's going to like that, but you can get through it, right? Well, I mean, before COVID, if you'd said, you can persuade free societies to stay at home and not go out, people thought that was nuts, but people did it if they have to. And I think it would be the same with this gas stuff. So I think in terms of like the hardship, the governments hopefully will cushion the cost of living blow to really vulnerable households. And beyond that, people will adapt. On the inflation side, I think it's true. The central bank is going to raise interest rates. What would be a particularly pernicious feedback loop is if that then caused an Italian bond crisis. And one of the interesting experiments going on in central bank world right now is whether it's possible for the European Central Bank, on the one hand, to be raising interest rates across the Eurozone, on the other hand, to be kind of inoculating Italy against the bond market effects that might flow from that. And they're trying to do both at the same time.
Pretty difficult recipe there. Let's move you to China and Taiwan. Do you see China taking uh, this as an opportunity to take over Taiwan?
I mean, binary answers, Larry, are very hard here. But if you ask me for probabilities, I would say that my probability for an attack on Taiwan by China in the next 3 years would be 50%, which is very high.
That's very high.
I mean, and my reason for worry is twofold. The first is that I think Xi Jinping has demonstrated a willingness to put kind of political imperatives ahead of prosperity, economic sense, liberty, you name it, by pursuing this COVID zero policy, which is an extraordinary choice. I mean, he could simply import excellent vaccines from the West, vaccinate the population, and be done with COVID. Instead, he locks down entire cities for extended periods. People are in their apartments, they can't get out to get food. These are wealthy middle-class societies where people are used to kind of going out and working, and they're stuck in their apartments. It's unbelievable, that level of draconian, and it's a choice. It's not an imperative. I mean, they could just have vaccines. So I think that's telling us that Xi Jinping will go a long way to sort of put his political priorities, in this case, the pride of not importing foreign vaccines and the pride of potentially reuniting China with Taiwan with China. I think there's a real danger that he would. And the second thing I would say is that just demographically, the Chinese are in trouble. Their economy is already showing signs of weakness, but that's going to get worse as the population rapidly grows. And their moment, if they're going to do something about Taiwan, their moment is kind of now, right? This is the apogee of their power. They're going to get gray from now on, fast. And therefore, if you were to say, what's the chances of China's attacking Taiwan over the next 15 years? And somebody said 50%, I would say, well, I want to compress all of that 50% probability in the next 3, because I think that's the window when Xi Jinping is in power, and when you've got this demographic point where your power is about to ebb.
And how do you see the U.S. responding? Just sitting back?
No, I think that Biden has sent plenty of signals that he would come to Taiwan's defense.
What does that mean? War with China?
I mean, potentially, yeah. Just like we've got one in Ukraine with Russia through a proxy. But I think it would happen again. I mean, if we're willing to do this with Ukraine, and now we're talking about Taiwan, which is, the dominant maker of high-end semiconductors, as we all know. Why would we do less on Taiwan than on Ukraine? It seems to me Taiwan is of far higher strategic importance.
But I mean, how do we, supplying Taiwan with equipment when they're so close to the Chinese mainland and to the anti-aircraft and missiles from the boats. The Chinese have this a larger navy, I guess, in terms of ships. Do you think this is really militarily feasible to defend Taiwan in the same manner we're defending Ukraine?
Well, probably we're both guessing here, but I would say that before the Ukraine war, we would not have predicted this amount of aid to Zelensky and Ukraine. But what happened was a combination of Ukrainian courage on the battlefield, which inspired the West, and Zelensky's sort of compelling personal style. And I think those two things politically drove Congress to a point where the US president had all the room he might have wanted to help Ukraine. And I think in the case of Taiwan, how would those things play out? Would The Taiwanese military show courage initially. They're defending their country. I mean, maybe they would. Are they preparing for an attack? I mean, they'd be crazy not to be. Is the US, are there military advisors there already telling Taiwan how to be doing this? One assumes yes. So I guess that initial resistance from Taiwan would be significant. This would drive a huge sympathy wave politically in the West. And there would be all sorts of arguments about how you can't let China get away with this, because if you do, then it basically owns the whole of East Asia. If you don't stand up to China now, then when will you ever? And I can see the logic, the kind of hawkish logic, driving the US to intervene significantly.
Okay, let me ask you one last question, then we want to move a bit to your book on this. But China, I'm about to come out with a paper called "The Future of Global Economic Power," with some Russian co-authors and Americans, where we're doing a big multi-year global simulation study of economic power growth, productivity growth, demographics taken into account based on the UN projections, even given all the, includes the aging of China. But you look at the end of the century, even in the middle of the century, China and India are about 45% of the world economy under reasonable assumptions. The US is going from like 16 down to 11% of the world economy. The Western Europe, including the UK, is going from about 18, 19% of the world GDP down to about 10%. So, I mean, the US can play the hegemon for a while, but...
That's interesting. Can I ask you a question about that? In the case of Asia's rise that you just described, what share of the rise is India and what share is China?
It's mostly India's about 10% of world GDP, and even with slow productivity growth, output per worker, and China's is about 30%. So it's about 3 times bigger than China by itself, 3 times bigger. So it seems like at some point we have to wake up to the realities that we're not going to be running the world down the path in the future. So that makes things a lot more, I think, complicated within this calculus.
But wouldn't the growth rate in India be much higher than in China in the next 20 years because demographics favor that in India?
Well, it turns out the demographics, the population growth is enormous in Africa. For example, the UN is projecting an increase in world population over the next 80 years of 2.5 Chinas. And most of that is concentrated in Africa and the Middle East. The U.S. is going to add about 100 million, 120 million, like the population of the Philippines by the end of the century, if we kind of get back to the regular kind of immigration story that we've had, in legal and illegal. China is going to lose about 400 million people, about the size of that's bigger than the U.S. population. But if their productivity per worker keeps going up, then the only reason they're not dramatically bigger economically now is just that their output per worker is a lot lower. But of course, they're engaged in all kinds of educational endeavors, that leads me to tying all this together to your book. We have Russia becoming potentially, if there's a stalemate, if there's just like this war of attrition that goes on for however long, we've had this big brain drain out of Russia. The ability of Russia to keep up economically, given that they're not going to have Western investment, and they're also not going to have the kind of Western venture capital system that you discuss in your book, The Power Law. And then there's China, on the other hand, doing things I think you're saying very similar. So tell us about the book. Give us the elevator's pitch, and we have time. You know, we don't have to stop exactly at the hour. We can go on 5-10 minutes, but tell us why this book is so thick. I need to spend the next month reading this every night, which I will, because I can't stop every page.
My excuse for a somewhat thick book is that it's thicker because there are stories, personalities, color, and it's more fun to read because I've added in those narrative lines. So it's a history focusing on Silicon Valley and the way that it grew up from the 60s through to the present day. And it tells the history of Silicon Valley through the eyes of the venture capital investors. So most histories of Silicon Valley are looking at the inventors and the entrepreneurs. And I'm taking a different tack and saying, what about the risk capital providers who underwrote all these moonshots? There are two aims here. One is just to explain, how does a venture capitalist think? Because most types of investor can rely on quantitative metrics to guide investment choices. When you're a venture capitalist and a two-legged mammal walks into your office with a dream, there's no price-earnings ratio, there's no price-to-book ratio, there's nothing. You just have to make a judgment about this person and their story and whether that's a plausible story. And then furthermore, you make a bet, but 8 out of 10 of your bets are going to go to zero because the startup will fail. It's very, very hard to build a startup. And if you think about other fields of investment, no hedge fund investor or normal mutual fund investor could survive in the career for more than 6 months if you had 8 out of 10 bets go to zero. I mean, it's just unthinkable. So it's a totally different mindset in venture capital where you're okay with losing 8 out of 10 because you're hoping that the 9th and the 10th will do more than a 10x return on your capital. That's a return of 1,000% on your position. Again, unthinkable in hedge fund space. So it's a very different kind of investing. So job one for me was just to explain that mentality of VC. What's the skill? How do you think if you want to be a VC? But then the second thing, which is more relevant to our discussion, is what does venture capital kind of do for innovation? To what extent in Silicon Valley did venture capitalists create the innovation, or did they just show up for it and piggyback off it? And there's a debate about that. And I come down on the side that they did help to create the innovation because you get clusters of smart engineers and smart inventors and smart entrepreneurs, but they're not going to generate lots of startups with a chance of breakout success unless they are connected up to each other. In a network theory tells us in sociology that networks are productive to the extent that they are internally connected with lots of nodes and lots of lines running between the nodes. And who are the superconnectors in a technology cluster? It's the venture capitalist who gets up in the morning, has coffee with one potential entrepreneur because he's thinking of making an investment in that person, and then has 14 other cups of coffee, hopefully decaffeinated before he goes to bed, because he's meeting with the people that he funded last month, and he's meeting with the people who might join those companies funded last month, like the first hires, the first engineers, introducing his portfolio companies to potential big customers. It's a networking business. And in that networking process, the VCs are connecting up the people and the money and the ideas and circulating them in the ecosystem and generating Silicon Valley. So as I describe, why Silicon Valley dominated innovation from, let's say, the 70s through to just recently, I put a lot of stress not on Stanford University being great, not on defense contracts flowing to the Silicon Valley contractors, but rather to the nature of the venture capital, which on the West Coast was more risk-friendly than the Boston VCs. And then I tell a story about how the secret sauce in the last 10 or 15 years has been understood the Silicon Valley power law mentality has been understood. And it's been, the secret sauce has been bottled and exported first to China, and then to India and Southeast Asia and Israel, and now a little bit to Europe. And so I think that this way of running applied science experiments in the form of lots of startups, which was dominated by Silicon Valley for the last 60 years or something, will not be necessarily dominated in the future by Silicon Valley. And there's a geopolitical message there that, the West can't, or America can't rely on having this magical monopoly of commercial innovation.
Very interesting. Yeah, it's like a bunch of super spreaders when it comes to technology that are
Right.
Yeah.
Now, is that going to China? Or
Yeah. Yes, I mean, the interesting thing is that, China has a very big technology ecosystem. Companies like Alibaba and Tencent and Baidu are really state of the art, and in some
Right.
cases, they're more advanced than their US competitors. And I was thinking, so where did that come from? And I'd read some books which kind of paid tribute to the state capitalist model in China and said the government had been very useful in making that happen. But when I actually went and tracked down the sort of origin stories of how did Alibaba get started, for example, what you find is that a Western investor, in this case, a woman called Shirley Lin from Goldman Sachs, basically, she was the first investor into Alibaba. She did a kind of venture capital style deal with Silicon Valley lawyers that she brought in to structure it. And she did it with, dispute settlement under American law and a Cayman Islands parent company so that you could have American style equity options for the early employees. And the equity options enabled Alibaba to hire top class talent, some of it Chinese Americans or Taiwanese Americans who would not have been possible to hire unless you had that bucket of options to give them. And so, really, it was the importation of the American venture capital model by Western companies. I just mentioned Goldman Sachs, but actually, today in China, the leading venture capital company is Sequoia China, and Sequoia Menlo Park is the leading venture capital company in the US. So it's the same company, and they've just basically taken the secret sauce, they've used it in China, they've done incredibly well, and so have lots of other Western venture capital outfits done the same thing. So China has had the benefit of that spreading. India is the same story. Western American venture capital companies going in there. A bit of that in Israel. It's happened a lot now in Europe. Sequoia just opened a London office a couple of years ago and is spreading the same secret sauce around Europe. There are companies like Accel, another Silicon Valley firm that has a branch in London. So yes, the model is spreading. Therefore, the startup culture is spreading. And therefore, successful commercial applied science is spreading.
Cool. Let me ask one last question here, because we've taken less of your time. But the color, the stories of the individual risk takers, the financiers during COVID. How did you couldn't see them physically? How did you get all this information about? Was it all Zoom conversations? Is it?
No, actually, see, I began my research in 2016, 2017. I do take 5 years to write these books. I mean, because in this case, I interviewed 250 people in the industry, and I went back to see a lot of them. And when I say interview, I mean like at least an hour sitting down with them face to face. So I followed up on Zoom a little bit once COVID hit with people I'd already met. But I already had kind of, done the interviews. The audio was in my computer.
Oh, cool. Great. Well, I think it's going to be a bestseller. It's The Power Law, Venture Capital in the Making of the New Future. It's not just the new or the past new future for the U.S., but the new future for the world, and has huge geopolitical implications as we've talked. So, Sebastian, can't thank you enough. This has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having me. Terrific.
Good.
Take care, both of you.
Good.